Elena moved quietly between the tables, carrying a silver tray of champagne glasses that probably cost more than her weekly paycheck. The Grand Bellamy Hotel ballroom sparkled under massive crystal chandeliers. And everywhere she looked, designer gowns and tailored tuxedos reminded her that she didn't belong here. Not really. She was just part of the scenery, like the ice sculptures and the flower arrangements that cost thousands of dollars. This was her life now. 26 years old, wearing a plain black uniform, being invisible to people who wouldn't remember her face 5 minutes after she refilled their drinks. The annual Founders Gala was the hotel's biggest night of the year. Everyone who was anyone in the city had paid $5,000 just for a seat at one of these tables. Tech billionaires, politicians, old money families whose names were on hospital wings and university buildings. Elena had learned to move through their world like a ghost. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. Smile politely. Clear the plates. Bring more wine. Disappear. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time when Elena had dreams that felt real enough to touch. When she'd wake up early, just to practice piano for 3 hours, before classes. When her mother would sit in their tiny living room and listen to her play Chopin, tears of pride in her eyes. When professors at the Belmont Conservatory told her she had something special. That rare combination of technical skill and emotional depth that couldn't be taught. That felt like a different lifetime now. A different girl. Her younger brother Miguel needed medication that cost more each month than most people's rent. The medical bills had piled up so high that Elena sometimes couldn't breathe when she thought about them. So she'd left the conservatory in her 3rd year. Left her dreams in a practice room and picked up a serving tray instead. Because that's what you do when someone you love is fighting just to breathe. You do whatever it takes. She glanced toward the stage, where a gleaming black Steinway grand piano sat waiting. Her chest tightened the way it always did when she saw a piano these days. It was like running into an old love who'd married someone else. Beautiful and painful at the same time. Near the piano, a man in an expensive suit was holding court with a small crowd of admirers. Victor Ashford, the famous pianist who'd flown in from Vienna to perform tonight. Elena had watched him play twice before at the hotel, standing in the back by the kitchen doors where the staff gathered during their breaks. He was technically brilliant, she'd give him that. Every note perfectly placed. But something about his playing felt cold to her. Like he was showing off, rather than sharing something real. Still, the guests loved him. They always did. He told charming stories about performing for European royalty and playing in famous concert halls. Elena caught fragments of his conversation as she passed with her tray. The acoustics in Prague are simply divine, Victor was saying, his accent making everything sound more impressive. Though, of course, the audience tonight will be far more sophisticated than most. Elena bit back a smile. Sophisticated might not be the word she'd use. She'd been serving these people for 2 years now. She'd seen them drunk, rude, and utterly oblivious to anyone they considered beneath them. But they had money. And money bought you the right to call yourself sophisticated. She was clearing dessert plates from a table of venture capitalists who were loudly debating crypto investments when she heard the commotion. Several people gasped. Elena turned to see Victor stumbling away from the piano, clutching his right hand against his chest. His face had gone pale and twisted with pain. The hotel manager rushed over, his usual calm completely shattered. A woman at a nearby table stood up and announced she was a doctor. She examined Victor's hand, while everyone watched in fascinated horror. The kind of horror that comes when your expensive entertainment suddenly falls apart. Severe muscle spasms, the doctor said loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Possibly a pinched nerve. He definitely cannot perform tonight. The ballroom erupted in worried whispers. Not worried for Victor, Elena noticed. Worried about what this meant for them. For their evening, for the charity auction that was supposed to raise $500,000 and give them all something to brag about at their next dinner party. The event coordinator looked like she might cry. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, probably trying to find another pianist at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. Good luck with that. Anyone worth booking was already performing somewhere else. Elena stood frozen near the kitchen doors, her empty tray forgotten in her hands. She watched the manager pacing, watched the guests growing restless and disappointed, watched the deputy mayor checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. And she couldn't stop looking at that piano. It sat there on the stage, silent and waiting under the soft spotlight. The lid was open, revealing the strings inside. Elena knew exactly how those keys would feel under her fingers, smooth and cool and responsive. She knew the weight of them, the way they'd resist, just enough, before giving way. She knew that this particular Steinway had a bright, clear tone in the upper register and a rich warmth in the bass notes. She'd played it once, actually. Late one night, about 6 months ago, when she'd been closing up the ballroom after an event. Everyone else had gone home. She'd been completely alone, and she'd sat down at that piano and played for 15 minutes, letting years of buried longing pour out through her fingers. It had felt like coming home and saying goodbye at the same time. "This is a disaster," the manager hissed to his assistant, standing close enough to Elena that she could hear every word. "We're about to humiliate ourselves in front of the most influential people in the city. The deputy mayor is here. The tech CEOs who donate millions are here. And we have nothing. No entertainment. No auction momentum. Nothing." His assistant mumbled something Elena couldn't hear. The manager shook his head violently. "I've called everyone. No one's available. We're finished." Elena's heart started pounding. Her palms went sweaty. There was a roaring sound in her ears that had nothing to do with the anxious chatter filling the ballroom. She knew she should stay quiet, keep her head down, stay invisible the way she'd trained herself to be. But her feet were already moving, walking toward the manager, even as her brain screamed at her to stop. This was crazy. This was career suicide. If she embarrassed herself in front of these people, she'd be fired. And she couldn't afford to be fired. Miguel needed her. The bills needed to be paid. Survival came first. Always. Yet somehow, she kept walking. "Excuse me, sir," she heard herself say, her voice barely audible over the noise. The manager turned, and the look on his face when he saw it was just a waitress interrupting him almost made Elena lose her nerve completely. His expression said everything. What could someone like you possibly have to say that matters? But Elena had already jumped off the cliff. There was no going back now. "I can play," she said, forcing the words out before courage abandoned her completely. "The piano. I can play it." The manager stared at Elena like she'd just spoken in a foreign language. His eyes traveled from her face to her uniform to the serving tray still in her hands. She could see the exact moment when confusion turned into something closer to anger. "You?" The word came out sharp. "You're a waitress." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A reminder of her place. Elena felt heat crawl up her neck. But she didn't back down. Not yet. She'd already said it. There was no unsaying it now. "I know, sir. But I studied piano at the Belmont Conservatory. I was there for 3 years before I had to." She stopped herself. "Before my mother got sick. Before the hospital bills. Before I had to choose between my dreams and my brother's life. Before I had to leave. I can do this. I promise." The manager's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. He looked back toward the stage, where Victor was being helped to a chair, still cradling his hand. Then he looked at the tables full of restless guests who'd paid serious money for an evening that was falling apart. Elena could practically see him doing the math in his head. What did he have to lose at this point? "If you embarrass this hotel," he said finally, his voice low and threatening, "you're fired. Do you understand me? But if somehow, and I mean somehow, you can actually pull this off." He didn't finish the sentence, just gestured toward the piano, with a look that said he thought she was insane. Elena nodded. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to set down the tray before she dropped it. "I understand." She walked toward the stage, and it felt like moving through water. Everything seemed to slow down. She was aware of every single eye in that massive ballroom tracking her movement. The conversations didn't stop immediately. At first, people just looked confused. Why was the help walking toward the piano? Was she going to move it? Clean it? But as Elena climbed the 3 steps onto the stage, the whispers started. What's happening? Is this part of the show? Where's Victor? Wait, is that the waitress? Elena heard a woman in a glittering silver dress laugh. Actually, laugh out loud. The sound cut through the murmurs like a knife. You cannot be serious right now. They're going to have the staff entertain us? What is this? A talent show? The people at her table joined in the laughter. Not mean laughter, exactly. Just the kind of amused disbelief that comes when something is so absurd you can't quite process it. A waitress, playing a concert grand piano, at a $5,000 a plate gala. It was ridiculous. Everyone could see that. Elena felt her face burning. Every instinct screamed at her to run. Get off this stage. Go back to being invisible where it was safe. She could still back out. Say she'd made a mistake. Apologize for the confusion. But then her fingers touched the keys. The piano bench was exactly the right height. She'd sat on this bench before. That one stolen night, when she thought no one would ever know. It fit her, like it had been waiting. Elena closed her eyes and took one deep breath. Just one. She thought about her mother. About sitting in their cramped living room with the piano that was always slightly out of tune because they couldn't afford to have it serviced. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to pay for Elena's lessons. Cleaned offices at night. Worked retail on weekends. Never complained once. She'd just smile and say, "Play for me, baby. Let me hear something beautiful." Elena thought about the conservatory. About Professor Holloway, who'd pulled her aside after class one day and said, "You have a gift. Don't waste it." About the scholarship she'd won. The one that was supposed to change everything. About the senior showcase she'd been preparing for when everything fell apart. She'd been planning to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 for that showcase. She'd spent months working on it. Knew every note, every phrase, every emotional shift. It was the piece that lived in her bones. The piece she played in her head while serving drinks and clearing plates. The piece that haunted her dreams. That was the piece she would play now. Elena opened her eyes. The ballroom was still there. 400 people were still staring at her, waiting for her to either prove herself or confirm that she was just a waitress with delusions. But somehow, they didn't matter anymore. The fear was still there, but it was distant now. Quieter. There was just Elena, the piano, and the music that had been trapped inside her for years. She began to play. The first notes of the Rachmaninoff concerto rolled out into the massive ballroom, filling every corner of the space. Deep, rich chords that felt like the sound of longing itself, of wanting something so badly it physically hurt. Elena's fingers moved across the keys, and it was like no time had passed at all. Like she'd never stopped playing. Like the 3 years of serving drinks and being invisible had been erased in an instant. The laughter died first. The woman in the silver dress stopped mid-giggle, her mouth hanging slightly open. Then the conversations dropped away. One by one, people went quiet, set down their drinks, turned toward the stage. Within 30 seconds, 400 people had gone completely silent. Elena wasn't thinking about technique anymore. Wasn't worried about hitting the right notes or keeping the tempo. Her body just knew what to do. Years of training and practice had built highways in her brain, pathways that hadn't disappeared just because she'd stopped using them. Her fingers flew over the keys, pulling out melody and harmony and emotion that she didn't even know she'd been holding inside. The music swelled and dipped, painting pictures in sound. Pain and beauty twisted together. Loss and hope fighting for space. Elena poured everything into it. Every morning, she'd woken up, exhausted. Every time she'd had to smile while someone treated her like furniture. Every night she'd gone home and cried because she missed her mother so much she couldn't breathe. Every moment of fear that Miguel might not make it. every dream she'd buried alive. All of it came out through the piano. She moved with the music, swaying slightly during the crescendos, her whole body involved in the act of creation. This wasn't just playing notes on a page. This was something else entirely, something raw and real and utterly honest in a way that made people uncomfortable because they could feel it. Really feel it. In the front row, an older man with silver hair and expensive glasses leaned forward. His eyes were wide, his expression intense. He'd been a music critic for 30 years, had heard every famous pianist alive at some point or another. And what he was hearing now made his hands grip the edge of the table. This wasn't just good. This was extraordinary. The deputy mayor had completely forgotten about his schedule. His assistant had tried to catch his attention twice to remind him about his next appointment. He'd waved her off, without looking away from the stage. At a side table, Victor himself sat with ice still wrapped around his injured hand. His face had gone through several expressions in the last few minutes. Shock, confusion, and now something that looked almost like respect. He recognized what he was hearing because he'd spent his entire life in the world of classical music. Technical skill was common. Talent was everywhere if you knew where to look. But this combination of absolute mastery and devastating emotional honesty, that was rare. That was the thing that separated good musicians from great ones. A woman 3 tables back felt tears running down her face and didn't bother wiping them away. She didn't even know why she was crying. She'd come here tonight for networking, to be seen, to post photos for social media. But something about this music had cracked something open inside her chest, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt something this real. Elena played on, lost in the world she was creating. The ballroom with its crystal and gold had disappeared. The people had faded away. There was just the music, building and building towards something that felt both like breaking and like healing at the same time. The final chord hung in the air like it didn't want to let go. Elena's hands stayed on the keys, her fingers still touching the ivory that had somehow become an extension of her own body. She didn't want to look up. Didn't want to leave this space where she'd felt completely herself for the first time in years. Here, in the music, she was exactly who she was supposed to be. Out there, in the real world, she was just a waitress who'd done something incredibly stupid. The silence stretched on. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Elena's heart sank. They hated it. Of course they hated it. What had she been thinking? These people wanted professional entertainment, not some washed-up conservatory dropout pouring her heart out all over their expensive evening. She'd just embarrassed herself in front of the entire city's elite. The manager was probably already writing up her termination papers. Then someone started clapping. It wasn't polite applause. Not the gentle, obligatory clapping that comes at the end of speeches nobody listened to. This was loud, forceful, real. Elena looked up, startled, and saw the silver-haired music critic on his feet, clapping with his hands high over his head. Tears were streaming down his face. But he was smiling, actually smiling like he'd just witnessed something miraculous. Then the woman who'd been crying stood up. Then the deputy mayor. Then Victor himself, awkwardly applauding with his good hand pressed against his chest. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on their feet. 400 people, all standing, all clapping so hard it sounded like thunder rolling through the crystal and gold. Elena stood on shaking legs, completely overwhelmed. Her vision blurred with tears. She didn't even realize she was crying. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to stay in her lane, keep her head down, survive quietly. But here she was, standing in front of hundreds of people who were looking at her. Really looking at her. Seeing her for the first time. The applause went on and on. People weren't just clapping anymore. They were shouting, "Bravo!" Someone yelled from the back, "Incredible!" shouted someone else. The woman in the silver dress who'd laughed at Elena earlier was now crying. Her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. The hotel manager appeared at the bottom of the stage steps, and Elena's stomach dropped. Here it comes, she thought. The anger. The firing. The reality check. But when she looked at his face, he wasn't angry. He looked stunned. And there was something else in his eyes. Something calculating. Like he'd just discovered oil in his backyard and was already figuring out how to profit from it. Before he could reach her, Victor stood and walked to the microphone stand near the piano. Someone handed him the microphone, and he raised his good hand to quiet the crowd. Gradually, the applause died down, though people remained standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his accent making everything sound more important. "I have performed in concert halls across Europe. Vienna, Prague, London. I have played for royalty and presidents, and the world's most distinguished audiences." He paused, turning to look directly at Elena. "And I can tell you, with complete honesty, that what we just witnessed was extraordinary." Fresh applause erupted, but Victor raised his hand again for silence. "This young woman has a gift that cannot be taught. Technical perfection? That can be learned. But this?" He gestured toward the piano, searching for words. "This depth of feeling, this authenticity, this ability to make us feel something real? That is rare. Incredibly rare." He turned back to Elena, genuine curiosity on his face. "You must tell us. Where did you study? Who was your teacher? How is it possible that someone with your talent is working as—" He stopped himself, probably realizing how insulting it might sound. But Elena knew what he meant. How could someone who played like that be serving drinks? The microphone was suddenly in Elena's hand, though she didn't remember anyone giving it to her. 400 faces stared at her, waiting, hungry for her story, wanting to understand how this impossible thing had just happened. Elena's throat felt tight. She didn't want to do this. Didn't want to unpack her tragedy for these strangers' entertainment. But they were waiting, and she couldn't just run off the stage like a frightened child. "I studied at Belmont Conservatory," she said quietly, her voice small after the power of the music. "Under Professor Catherine Holloway. I was there on scholarship for 3 years." She saw recognition flash across several faces. The Belmont Conservatory was prestigious. A scholarship there meant something. It meant she hadn't just been good. She'd been exceptional. "I had to leave in my 3rd year," Elena continued, and then stopped. What could she say? That her mother died of cancer? That the medical bills buried them? That her 16-year-old brother had cystic fibrosis and needed medications that cost more than most people's mortgage? That she'd had to choose between her dreams and her brother's life, and it wasn't even really a choice at all? She couldn't say all that. Couldn't bear to see their faces shift from admiration to pity. Couldn't stomach the idea of becoming an inspiration story for rich people to feel good about at their next charity event. "I had family responsibilities," she said simply. The ballroom had gone quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. Uncomfortable. Like people were doing math in their heads and not liking the answer they were getting. How many talented people were out there right now, serving their tables and cleaning their offices and driving their cars? How many gifts were being wasted because the cost of survival was too high? The silver-haired critic stood up again. "Catherine Holloway," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "I know Catherine. She was one of the finest instructors in the country before she retired. If you were her student—" He trailed off, seeming to make a decision. "What's your name, dear?" Elena hesitated. Once she said it, this became real. This moment would be attached to her name forever. She couldn't take it back. "Elena," she said finally. "Elena Morales." The critic nodded slowly, like he was memorizing it. "Miss Morales, my name is Harrison Wells. I've been a music critic for 3 decades. I've heard every famous pianist alive at some point. And what you just played? He shook his head in wonder. That was among the most moving performances I've ever heard. The technical skill was flawless. But that's not what made it special. You played with your whole soul. That's something no amount of training can create. In a ment. Better. He pulled out his phone, his fingers already moving across the screen. Would you allow me to make some phone calls? There are people who need to hear you play. Venues. Foundations. Organizations that support emerging artists. Elena felt dizzy. This was too much, too fast. An hour ago she'd been clearing dessert plates and worrying about whether she'd make enough in tips to cover the electricity bill. Now a famous music critic was talking about venues and foundations like these were real possibilities for her life. I don't understand, she said honestly. I'm not an emerging artist. I'm a waitress. I left the conservatory years ago. Harrison smiled kindly. You left school. But you never stopped being an artist. That was evident in every note you played. He glanced around the ballroom at all the wealthy, influential people still watching this exchange. Sometimes, talent just needs one chance, one moment where the right people are paying attention. The manager finally made it to the stage, and Elena could see the wheels turning in his head. Miss Morales has been a valued member of our staff, he said loudly. Which was a complete lie. He'd barely known her name before tonight. The Grand Bellamy is proud to have such talent within our organization. Perhaps we could arrange for regular performances. With all due respect, Victor interrupted smoothly. Miss Morales shouldn't be performing in hotel lobbies for tips. She should be on a concert stage. He looked at Elena directly. You have the real thing. Don't let anyone convince you to settle for less. Elena's head was spinning. The applause, the praise, the sudden attention from people who hadn't seen her at all 5 minutes ago. Part of her wanted to believe it was real, that this night could actually change something. But another part, the part that had learned hard lessons about hope and disappointment, kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. The deputy mayor approached the stage, extending his business card. The city has grants for the arts, he said. Programs to support local talent. You should apply. More people were coming forward now. Business cards, appearing from expensive purses and suit pockets. Names and numbers and promises of opportunities. The woman in silver was crying and apologizing for laughing. A tech CEO wanted to know if she taught lessons for his daughter. A socialite was talking about a fundraiser that needed entertainment. Elena took the cards with numb fingers, nodding and thanking people while her brain struggled to process what was happening. Her coworkers stood in a cluster by the kitchen doors, watching with expressions ranging from shock to genuine happiness. Rosa, who'd trained Elena on her first day, was crying and giving her a thumbs up. But through all of it, all Elena could think about was Miguel. Sitting at home with his oxygen tank, probably watching some science documentary and eating the soup she'd left for him. Miguel, who'd told her just last week that she should try playing piano again, that their mom would want her to. Maybe he'd been right. The next week felt like living in someone else's life. Elena still showed up for her shifts at the Grand Bellamy. Still wore the same black uniform. Still carried trays of champagne and cleared plates. But everything had changed in ways both wonderful and deeply uncomfortable. Guests recognized her now. The ones who'd been at the gala would stop her to take photos. That's her. Then, they'd whisper to their companions. The waitress who played that incredible piano piece. Some of them were genuinely kind, congratulating her with real warmth in their voices. Others treated her like a novelty, an interesting story to tell at dinner parties. You'll never believe what happened at the Bellamy Gala. She imagined them saying. The help turned out to be a musical genius. The hotel manager called her into his office 3 days after the gala. Elena went, expecting the worst, but instead, he offered her a raise and a new position. She could perform in the hotel lobby twice a week during afternoon tea service. Nothing too demanding. Just an hour here and there, playing background music for guests. The pay increase would help. It really would. But something about the offer made Elena's stomach turn. She'd be performing the same way she served drinks. Present, but invisible. Entertainment that people could ignore while they chatted and checked their phones. Her gift reduced to ambient noise. She'd thanked him politely and said she'd think about it. The real earthquake came from Harrison Wells, the music critic. He'd been serious about making phone calls. 2 days after the gala, Elena received an email that she had to read 3 times before she believed it was real. Harrison had contacted Professor Holloway, her old teacher from the conservatory. They'd both reached out to the Cornerstone Foundation, a charitable organization that had been at the gala. The foundation supported artists from difficult backgrounds, people whose talent might otherwise be lost to economic circumstances. They wanted to offer Elena something that seemed too impossible to be true: a full scholarship to return to Belmont Conservatory and complete her degree, plus a monthly stipend that would cover living expenses. And most incredibly, a separate grant specifically designated for medical costs. For Miguel. Elena sat in the tiny apartment she shared with her brother, staring at the acceptance letter on the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled. Miguel was asleep on the couch, oxygen cannula in his nose, an astronomy textbook open on his chest. He'd fallen asleep reading again, the way he always did. The numbers in the letter didn't feel real. The stipend alone was more than she made in a month of waitressing. The medical grant would cover Miguel's medications and treatments for 2 full years. 2 years of not lying awake at night, calculating which bills to pay and which to let slide. 2 years of not choosing between her brother's health and keeping the lights on. But there were conditions. The foundation wanted her to be visible. They'd want her to perform at their annual concert series, to give interviews, to be the face of their mission, the inspiring story they could show to donors. Look what your money can do. Look at this girl we saved. Elena wasn't sure how she felt about that. About having her struggle packaged neatly for consumption. About becoming an inspiration story for wealthy people who'd never had to choose between dreams and survival. But what choice did she really have? Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Miguel needed this. She needed this. Miguel woke up while she was still staring at the letter. He blinked sleepily, then saw her face and sat up quickly, wincing slightly at the movement. "What's wrong?" he asked, always jumping straight to worry. That's what chronic illness did to a person. Made them assume bad news was always just around the corner. "Nothing's wrong," Elena said, and her voice cracked. She handed him the letter with trembling hands. "Everything's right. Everything's so right. I don't know how to process it." She handed him the letter. Miguel read the letter once, then again more slowly. His eyes got wider with each paragraph. When he looked up, tears were streaming down his face. "Elena," he whispered. "This is it. This is everything." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Miguel stood up carefully, crossed the small kitchen, and wrapped his arms around her. He was taller than her now, had been for the past year, but he was so thin, too thin. The disease eating away at him from the inside. "You did it," he said against her shoulder. "Mom would be so proud of you." That broke something open inside Elena's chest. She sobbed into her brother's shirt. Years of held-back tears, finally finding their way out. Tears for their mother who'd worked herself to exhaustion so Elena could have music lessons. Tears for the girl she'd been at the conservatory, so full of hope and possibility. Tears for every shift she'd worked while her hands ached to touch piano keys instead of serving trays. Tears of relief that maybe, things were finally going to be okay. They stood there in their cramped kitchen, holding each other and crying, while the acceptance letter sat on the table promising a future that had seemed impossible just a week ago. Over the next few days, Elena made her decisions. She gave notice at the Grand Bellamy, politely declining the manager's counteroffer of more money to stay. She met with Harrison Wells and Professor Holloway over coffee, discussing her return to the conservatory. She signed papers for the foundation, agreeing to their terms even though part of her bristled at being turned into a symbol. Professor Holloway looked older than Elena remembered. More gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. But when she hugged Elena, she smelled the same, like vanilla and sheet music and the lavender sachets she kept in her office. "I never stopped thinking about you," the professor said softly. "When you left, I tried to find resources to help, but by the time I'd gathered anything useful, you'd already disappeared. Changed your phone number. I couldn't find you. Thanks for watching. And I'm next on. And I'm Baran." Elena felt a stab of guilt. She'd cut ties with everyone from the conservatory because it hurt too much. Every reminder of that world had felt like a knife twisting in an open wound. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just couldn't. It was too hard." Professor Holloway squeezed her hand. "Don't apologize. You survived. You kept your brother alive. That took a different kind of courage than performing ever does." She paused, studying Elena's face. "But I need to ask you something honestly. Do you still love it? The piano? Or has survival killed that love?" Elena thought about the question seriously. She thought about that night at the gala, sitting at the Steinway, and feeling like she'd come home after being lost for years. She thought about all the times she'd heard music in her head while serving drinks, her fingers twitching with phantom movements. She thought about Miguel telling her their mom would want her to play. "I never stopped loving it," she said finally. "I just had to put it away to survive. Like packing up something precious during a storm. But it was always there, waiting." The professor smiled. "Good. Because talent without love is just technical skill. Love without talent is just enthusiasm. But both together? That's what makes an artist." The foundation wanted to film Elena for their promotional materials. She agreed reluctantly, showing up to the scheduled shoot, feeling awkward and exposed. They asked her to play piano while cameras recorded from multiple angles. Asked her to talk about her journey, her challenges, her gratitude for their support. Elena did it because she had to. Because this was the price of the opportunity. But she hated every minute of feeling like a product being marketed. The director kept asking her to show more emotion or to really convey the struggle. Like her actual life wasn't enough. Like they needed her to perform her pain for maximum impact. But then she thought about Miguel, thought about 2 years of medical bills covered, thought about walking back into a conservatory practice room with nothing but time and a piano. And she gave them what they wanted, performed gratitude and inspiration and hope because that's what they needed her to be. At night, alone in the apartment, she let herself feel more complicated things. Gratitude. Yes. Real gratitude that made her chest ache. But also frustration that this was what it took. That talent wasn't enough on its own. That she'd needed to become a viral video, a feel-good story, an inspiration for wealthy donors before anyone would invest in her future. She felt guilty for feeling frustrated. Felt like she should just be happy and grateful, and nothing else. But emotions were messy, and Elena was learning that she could be both thankful for the opportunity and angry that the opportunity only came after public spectacle. Miguel caught her in one of these complicated moods, staring out their small window at the city lights. "You okay?" he asked, settling next to her with his portable oxygen tank. "Yeah," Elena said, then more honestly, "I don't know. I'm grateful. I really am. But I also feel like a performing monkey sometimes. Like they want me to be inspiring but not too real. Grateful, but not complicated." Miguel nodded slowly. "They want a story with a neat ending. Girl struggles, girl gets discovered, girl is saved. Nobody wants to hear that you're still angry about having to struggle in the first place." Elena looked at her little brother, surprised by his insight. When had he gotten so wise? "But here's what I think," Miguel continued. "You take their opportunity. You use their money and their resources. And then you become so good, so undeniable, that you get to tell your own story. On your terms." Elena smiled. reaching over to ruffle his hair the way she'd done when he was little. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart," he grinned back. "You were just too busy being brilliant to notice." 3 months until the fall semester started. 3 months to prepare, to practice, to remember how to be a student instead of a survivor. Elena pulled out the course catalog Professor Holloway had given her and started planning. Music theory, advanced composition, performance studies, chamber music ensemble. Her hands trembled slightly as she circled classes with a pencil. Not from fear this time. From anticipation. From the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was getting a second chance at the life she was supposed to live. 3 months passed like a dream. Elena spent her days practicing at the conservatory's facilities, her fingers remembering things her conscious mind had forgotten. Scales and arpeggios, complex passages from Chopin and Liszt. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of serving trays and exhaustion, just waiting to be awakened. Professor Holloway worked with her 3 times a week, pushing her harder than anyone had in years. Not with cruelty, but with the high expectations that come from genuine belief. "You're good," she'd say. "But good isn't enough. You have the gift. Now we need to sharpen it until it cuts like a diamond." Elena practiced until her hands ached, until she could play difficult passages in her sleep, until the piano felt less like an instrument and more like a part of her own body. Miguel would come to her practice sessions when his health allowed, sitting quietly in the corner and doing homework while she played. Sometimes she'd catch him smiling, just listening, and she'd remember why she was doing this. Not for the Foundation's cameras or Harrison's reviews or anyone's inspiration. For Miguel, for her mother's memory, for herself. The Cornerstone Foundation scheduled her first major performance for a Friday evening in October. Morrison Hall, the city's premier concert venue, the same stage where famous pianists from around the world had performed. The same stage Elena used to dream about as a teenager, never quite believing she'd actually stand on it. The week before the concert, Elena barely slept. She practiced obsessively, working through the program she'd selected. The Rachmaninoff that had started everything, a Debussy piece that felt like water and moonlight, a Beethoven sonata that demanded both power and precision, and finally, a contemporary piece by a living composer, something raw and modern that spoke to struggle and survival. The night before the performance, Elena had a panic attack in the practice room. Her hands were shaking too badly to play. Her breath came in short, painful gasps. What was she thinking? Who was she to perform at Morrison Hall? She was just a waitress who'd gotten lucky. One viral moment didn't make her a real pianist. These people would see right through her. They'd know she didn't belong. Professor Holloway found her curled up on the piano bench, crying into her knees. "I can't do this," Elena gasped. "I'm not ready. I'm going to fail and embarrass everyone who believed in me." The professor sat down next to her, not touching, just present. She let Elena cry for a while before speaking. "Do you know what I remember most about teaching you?" she said finally. "It wasn't your technical skill, though that was impressive. It was the way you played, like your life depended on it. Like the music was the only language that could express what you were feeling." Elena wiped her eyes, listening. "That night at the gala," Professor Holloway continued, "you weren't performing for anyone. You were playing because you had to, because the music demanded to come out. That's what made it extraordinary." She turned to look at Elena directly. "Tomorrow night, don't perform for the audience. Don't perform for the Foundation, or for me, or for anyone watching. Play for yourself. Play because you love it. Everything else will follow." Elena nodded, taking a shaky breath. "What if I mess up? What if I forget something, or hit wrong notes?" Professor Holloway smiled gently. "Then you mess up. You're human. But I promise you, if you play with the same honesty you played that night at the hotel, nobody will care about a few wrong notes. They'll remember how you made them feel." The next evening, Elena stood backstage at Morrison Hall, wearing a borrowed navy blue gown that Professor Holloway had insisted she take. Her hair was styled, her hands were steady, but her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Through the curtain, she could hear the audience settling in. Over 700 people had bought tickets. 700. She peeked through the gap in the curtain and her breath caught. The front row was full of familiar faces. Professor Holloway sat there, already crying, and the concert hadn't even started. Harrison Wells was next to her, notepad ready but looking almost nervous himself. Victor Ashford had come, his hand fully healed now, smiling encouragingly at the empty stage. The deputy mayor was there with his wife. The hotel manager who'd almost fired her sat in the third row. Rosa and some of her other co-workers from the Grand Bellamy had pooled their money for balcony seats. Even some of the guests from the gala had returned, wanting to hear more of what they'd witnessed that night. And there, in the very front, in a seat with extra space for his equipment, sat Miguel. His oxygen tank was beside him, the cannula in his nose, but his smile was brighter than the stage lights. Next to him was an empty seat. Elena had reserved it without quite knowing why. Maybe for her mother, maybe for the girl she used to be, maybe just as a reminder that she'd made it here from somewhere that had felt impossible to escape. The stage manager touched her shoulder. 2 minutes, Miss Morales. Elena took a long, deep breath. Then, another. She thought about the past 3 years. Every double shift. Every condescending guest who'd treated her like she was invisible. Every night she'd gone home, exhausted, and cried into her pillow. Every time she'd walked past a piano and felt her heart break a little. But she also thought about the strength it had taken to survive all that. The courage it had required to keep going when everything felt hopeless. The love that had made her sacrifice her dreams so Miguel could breathe. That wasn't weakness. That was power. And all of it was in her now, ready to pour out through her fingers. "I'm ready," she said. The stage manager nodded and spoke into his headset. The house lights dimmed. The audience quieted. And Elena walked onto the stage of Morrison Hall. The applause was immediate and warm, but Elena barely heard it. She was focused on the piano, waiting for her under the spotlight. A beautiful Steinway concert, grand, perfectly tuned, ready. She sat on the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed her hands on the keys. The same hands that had served thousands of drinks. The same hands that had cleaned tables and carried heavy trays until her shoulders ached. The same hands that had held her brother when he couldn't breathe and held her mother's hand as she died. These hands had survived everything. And now they were home. Elena closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought about her mother. Wished she could be here to see this. Thought about Miguel in the front row. Probably trying not to cry. Thought about everyone who'd helped her get to this moment and everyone who'd doubted her along the way. Then she began to play. The Rachmaninoff flowed out into the concert hall, filling every corner with sound. But this time, it was different from the gala performance. This time, Elena wasn't desperate or defiant. She was claiming something that had always been hers. Every note said, "I belong here. I earned this. This is who I am." The audience disappeared again. The pressure disappeared. There was just Elena, and the music, and the pure joy of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She moved through the program flawlessly. Not because every note was perfect, they weren't, but because every note was honest. The Debussy rippled like water. The Beethoven thundered with power. The contemporary piece spoke of struggle and transcendence in a way that made people lean forward in their seats. When Elena played the final chord and let the sound fade to silence, she opened her eyes and really looked at the audience for the first time. 700 people on their feet before she'd even taken her hands off the keys. Applause so loud it felt like being wrapped in sound. Miguel crying and laughing at the same time, both hands over his heart. Professor Holloway openly sobbing. Harrison frantically writing notes with tears dripping onto the paper. Victor applauding above his head, shaking his head in amazement. Elena stood and took a bow. And the applause somehow got louder. People were shouting her name. Elena! Elena! Not the waitress anymore. Just Elena. A pianist. An artist. A person who'd survived impossible things and somehow, against all odds, found her way back to where she belonged. She bowed again, deeper this time, letting herself feel the moment fully. The gratitude, the joy, the pride, the complicated mixture of pain for what she'd lost and triumph for what she'd found. All of it was real. All of it was hers. When she finally left the stage, Professor Holloway was waiting in the wings with open arms. "You did it," she whispered as Elena collapsed into the hug. "Your mother would be so proud." "I know," Elena said. And she did know. Could feel it like a truth written on her bones. Later, after the crowds had cleared and the congratulations had been given and the reviewers had left to write their pieces, Elena sat alone in the empty concert hall. Miguel had gone home with one of their neighbors, exhausted but happy. Everyone else had headed to the reception. But Elena had asked for just a few minutes alone with the piano. She sat on the bench and played quietly, just for herself. Nothing complicated. Just a simple melody her mother used to hum while cooking dinner. A lullaby from childhood. A few bars of a pop song Miguel liked. The music echoed in the empty hall, intimate and soft. This was what it was really about. Not the applause or the reviews or the opportunities that would come. Just this. The feeling of her fingers on keys. The sound filling space. The pure, simple act of making something beautiful exist in the world. Elena smiled to herself in the darkness of the empty concert hall. But somehow, through all of it, she'd held on to the one thing that mattered most. Herself, her gift, her music, and nobody could take that away ever again. She played one final chord, let it ring out into the silence, and then stood up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more performances, finishing school, supporting Miguel, building a career. All of it would be hard in different ways than serving drinks had been hard. But tonight, Elena Morales was exactly who she was meant to be. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.